everyone, and welcome to Dreamy Tales. I know a lot of you listen to these stories as you drift off to sleep. But tonight, before you close your eyes, let me take you somewhere unsettling. A place where the familiar turns foreign and the silence gets a bit too close. If you're enjoying these stories, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, get comfortable. Let's begin. The window in the woods. I wasn't looking for an escape, not at first. But when my uncle offered me the keys to his old cabin, I couldn't resist. I'd been to the cabin once before, years ago, back when I was a kid. I only remembered flashes of it, an old wooden structure deep in the forest, with thick, gray fog clinging to the trees. The quiet, he told me, would be a good way to clear my head. So, on a rainy afternoon, I drove up to the cabin, the road winding deeper and deeper into the woods. By the time I reached it, daylight was fading, and mist had settled like a heavy blanket over the trees. The cabin looked just as I remembered, except older. The wood was darker, as if the forest itself was trying to pull it under. I walked up to the door, and just as I reached for the handle, I noticed something strange. Next to the door, there was a small window, about the size of a shoebox. I didn't remember that from before. It was strange because the cabin only had one big window in the main room. I brushed it off and went inside, hoping to shake off the odd feeling. The first night passed uneventfully, though I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I glanced over, that little window was there, set just above the ground level. Small enough that I couldn't see much through it, but big enough that I felt exposed. But I shook it off, laughed a little at myself, and went to bed. The second day, it rained heavily, forcing me to stay inside. As the day passed, the window seemed closer. I'd look up from my book, and there it was. The edges dark, a faint glimmer of light behind it as if someone was standing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft scraping sounds, like something was moving just outside, brushing against the cabin walls. I told myself it was just animals. But as the hours dragged on, the sounds got louder. My heart raced, each scrape echoing in the silence. And then, at around 3 a.m., I heard a soft, deliberate tapping. Right on that little window. I froze, barely breathing. The tapping grew louder, faster, like someone desperate to be let in. I wanted to get up, to close the curtain over it, but fear rooted me to my spot. Just as I gathered the courage to move, the tapping stopped. A silence hung in the air, thick and stifling. Suddenly, I heard a voice, faint and muffled. "I know you're awake." Every hair on my body stood on end. I forced myself to stay silent, to pretend I hadn't heard it. My mind raced, grasping at any explanation. Was it some prank? An animal? But then the voice came again, a low whisper, impossibly close. Look at me. My eyes darted toward the window, and I felt a jolt of terror. A shadow had appeared just outside the glass, barely visible, like a figure pressed close to the ground, watching me. I scrambled out of bed, feeling panic set in, and stumbled toward the main door. But just as I reached it, I heard something that stopped me cold. The front door's lock clicked open. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Slowly, I backed away, clutching the handle of a flashlight from the shelf beside the door. I switched it on, and the beam of light cut through the darkness. I aimed it at the small window, half expecting to see nothing, but the shadow was still there, perfectly still. And then, it moved. Slowly, as if rising from the ground, a face appeared in the window. It was pale, eyes wide and unblinking, with a strange, twisted smile that stretched too far across its face. The lips moved, forming a silent word. A name. My name. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the cabin and ran blindly into the forest, branches and roots tearing at my clothes. I didn't look back, not even when I heard footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind me, keeping pace. I don't know how long I ran, but I finally reached the road and flagged down a car. The driver looked at me, wide-eyed, as I gasped for breath and begged him to drive. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle thought I was exaggerating, but I knew better. The next time I saw him, he mentioned that the little window had always been there, only it had been sealed up when he bought the cabin. He never told me why. But I still see that face sometimes, in reflections, just out of the corner of my eye. And every time, I swear I hear it whisper, "Look at me." Thank you for joining the Horror Nook. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep. Let me know what you think, or if you want more like this. This style uses psychology to build a sense of dread, incorporating a few classic horror elements, unseen threats, ambiguous voices, and a place that feels sinister. Perfect for listeners who want just enough detail to let their imaginations run wild. My friends and I were thrill seekers. When we saw an old fishing boat for rent, we didn't hesitate. An abandoned island, they promised, no tourists, no guideposts, just us and the wilderness. So, we packed for the trip, our laughter filling the boat as we charted a course to the unknown. On the second day, we spotted the island. Tall trees brushed against a haunting sky, and shadows draped across the sand as if hiding something beneath. It was beautiful, in a wild and untamed way. We rowed ashore and secured the boat, or so we thought. At first, the island was a paradise. But as the sun dipped lower, I noticed a peculiar smell, like something had been rotting, though there was nothing around. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just seaweed, and joined my friends in setting up camp. We lit a small fire, laughed, and exchanged ghost stories, daring each other to explore the darker paths we hadn't yet ventured down. But when we turned to head back to the boat, our hearts sank. The boat wasn't there. We looked around, disbelief turning to panic as we realized it had drifted out. One of us must have forgotten to tie it securely. Helpless, we watched it become a distant dot on the horizon. I assured everyone we'd be fine. The island wasn't that far from shore. But I could see the unease in their faces. As night fully took hold, the island's ambience shifted. The quiet grew oppressive, broken only by the waves crashing against rocks, like whispers warning us to leave. And then, in the distance, we heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps. "Is someone else here?" whispered Leah, her voice barely audible over the waves. We strained to listen. A shadow emerged from the tree-line, gaunt and pale, moving slowly toward us. He wore tattered clothes, and his hair was matted, hanging like wet vines around his face. His eyes glinted in the firelight, too bright for someone who had supposedly been stranded. "Lost?" he asked, voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in ages. Our boat." I stammered, not knowing how much to say. He nodded, smiling a smile that held no warmth. "I've been here a long time," he muttered, almost to himself, and gestured for us to follow him. "I've found places. Safe places." As he walked ahead, his footsteps left no marks on the sand. I glanced back at my friends. They were as confused as I was, but something about the men was magnetic. Against my better judgment, we followed. He led us down a twisted path into the trees, where branches seemed to close around us. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the isolation, we reached a clearing. There, in the center, was what looked like the remains of an ancient vessel, half buried in the earth and overgrown with moss. Scraps of metal and rotting wood lay scattered, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow it. "Your boat?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. The men laughed, a hollow sound. "No, but it's a place for the lost. Those who stay too long." He paused, staring into the wreckage, and then, without warning, turned to us, his eyes filled with something dark. "But you know, it's hard to be alone for so long. Sometimes I wonder if I'm alone at all." He drifted off, as if lost in thought, before locking his eyes on us, gaze hard and unblinking. It would be easier if I wasn't alone anymore. A cold chill ran down my spine. I felt my heart pound, urging me to move, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Let's go back," I managed to say, finally tearing my gaze away. He smiled, and this time it wasn't just his mouth. It was in his eyes, his whole face twisted with a gleeful malice. Why leave? You're already where you belong. Without thinking, I grabbed my friends and bolted back down the path. Branches whipped against our faces, but we didn't stop. I could hear his voice, calm and steady, trailing behind us. There's no going back, you know. Not from here. When we reached the beach, I couldn't believe my eyes. The boat was there, gently rocking with the waves. It seemed untouched, as if it had never drifted at all. Without looking back, we climbed aboard, adrenaline fueling us as we pushed away from the shore. Just before we broke away completely, I caught a glimpse of him standing on the sand, watching us. But he wasn't alone. Other shadows had gathered behind him, figures barely visible in the moonlight. Silent, still, watching. As we drifted away, I heard his voice one last time, carried by the wind. Come back soon. We'll be waiting. We were looking for adventure, so a trip to an isolated island seemed perfect. It was supposed to be uncharted, untouched. No one's been out here in years, the boat operator said with a strange gleam in his eye. Not for long, anyway. We dismissed it as an attempt to scare us and shrugged it off. The first day was amazing. We explored dense forests and made camp near the beach, where we could see the stars reflecting off the dark waves. The only sound was the whispering of the trees and the occasional caw of a bird. But on the second night, everything changed. Around midnight, I woke up, sensing someone was watching me. I nudged my friend, Charlie, but he was already awake, sitting up and staring into the forest. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears. Faint, eerie whispers drifted from the darkness. They were too soft to make out, like a hushed conversation just out of reach. Every now and then, a word would stand out, chilling in its clarity. Stay. Lost. We told ourselves it was the wind moving through the trees, but the whispers grew louder, closer. Unable to sleep, we decided to move closer to the beach, hoping the open space would ease our nerves. But as we approached the shore, we noticed something horrifying. All around the sand were footprints, circling our camp in wide, deliberate loops. Some of them led straight to where we'd been lying down, only to vanish into the trees. Charlie muttered nervously, "Who would come all the way out here?" We turned to leave, but stopped in our tracks. Behind us, standing just at the edge of the trees, were faint, shifting figures. They seemed to fade in and out, as though caught between worlds. Their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, like embers. "Run," Charlie whispered, his voice shaking. We sprinted back toward the forest, hearts pounding. The shadows followed, gliding silently between the trees, almost drifting. It was as if they were waiting, watching, enjoying the chase. Somehow, we found our way to a small cave, hoping the darkness inside would hide us. The whispers grew louder, filling the cave with a suffocating weight. My mind felt foggy, like the whispers were clawing into my thoughts. As we huddled in silence, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see Charlie, but he was on the other side of the cave. I froze. In the shadows behind me, a figure leaned close, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were empty, dark voids pulling me in. The figure spoke, its voice an unnatural blend of male and female tones. You came willingly. This place was meant to stay forgotten. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to look away. The figure's face was shifting, changing into different people, each expression filled with silent screams. Suddenly, Charlie yanked me out of the cave, snapping me back to reality. We ran toward the beach, praying for any sign of escape. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees bending, twisting, as if trying to trap us. As dawn broke, we stumbled out onto the beach, gasping with relief. In the distance, we saw a fishing boat drifting toward us. We waved frantically, shouting, tears streaming down our faces as we begged for help. The boat reached us, and the fisherman pulled us aboard, his face grim. "I've seen this before," he muttered. What do you mean?" I stammered, desperate for answers. He looked at us, his eyes haunted. "That island isn't just deserted. It keeps what it wants. Many who go there never leave." As we sailed away, I dared to glance back at the shore. There, standing in a row, were shadowy figures, watching us with hollow eyes. But among them, I saw something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me, a familiar face. It was Charlie, standing there, even though he was right beside me on the boat. I turned, my heart racing. The man next to me was staring ahead, blank-eyed, his face shifting subtly, just like the figures on the island. The boat reached the mainland, but I never saw Charlie again. We had heard the local legends, the warnings whispered around fires at the coastal bars. They called it Siren's Rest, an island known to lure travelers in, never to return. But we laughed it off. Legends are always exaggerations, right? My friend, Chris, and I rented a boat and set out one early morning, our minds on adventure and exploration. The sea was calm, the air brimming with salt and mystery as we neared the island. From afar, it looked beautiful, lush trees, wildflowers scattered like patches of paint on a green canvas, and a faint mist clinging to the shore. We anchored the boat and walked ashore, feeling a strange pull as we stepped onto the sand. Everything was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no breeze, just a heavy, oppressive silence hanging over the island. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After exploring the island's dense forest, we stumbled upon something strange: stone statues, nearly hidden by vines and moss, scattered among the trees. Each one was lifelike, detailed down to the expression of terror frozen on every face. Some clutched their throats, others covered their eyes, and one had its mouth wide open in a silent scream. "Didn't you say people used to live here?" Chris asked, looking around nervously. "Yeah, maybe these are just artifacts from back then," I suggested, trying to rationalize. But the truth was, they seemed too real, too alive. As the sun started to set, a thick fog rolled in, and the island's silence became more intense, like a held breath. We began to feel uneasy, like something was closing in on us. Then, we heard it, a low hum, soft and melodic, coming from deep within the island. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Chris nodded, wide-eyed. Drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, we followed the sound, which grew louder and more haunting as we went deeper into the forest. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the mist, a woman, her pale skin luminous, almost ghostly, her eyes vacant and yet knowing. "Turn back," she said softly. Her voice was beautiful, like music, but hollow and chilling. "Leave while you can." We were frozen, unable to look away. But when I blinked, she was gone, leaving only the whispering fog behind. Panicked, we tried to retrace our steps, but the forest seemed to shift around us, twisting and changing as if the island itself didn't want us to leave. After what felt like hours, we found ourselves in a clearing with more statues, but this time, they were different. Each statue looked vaguely familiar, like us. And the expressions on their faces were now distorted with agony. A shiver ran down my spine as Chris's eyes widened in terror. "Are those?" "Yes," I managed to stammer. "It's us." Suddenly, the fog grew thicker, suffocating. We could barely see a few feet ahead. That's when I felt something cold and sharp touch my shoulder. I turned, and there she was again, the ghostly woman, her eyes piercing, sad but ruthless. "Why didn't you listen?" she murmured, almost mournfully. Her voice was hypnotic, like a lullaby, and my limbs began to feel heavy, as if they were turning to stone. "No!" Chris yelled, snapping me out of the trance. He grabbed my arm, and we ran blindly through the mist, stumbling over roots, tearing through branches, desperate to escape. We finally broke through to the beach, gasping for air as the first light of dawn broke through the fog. But our boat, it was gone. The shoreline was empty. "No, no, no!" Chris shouted, frantically scanning the water. That's when we heard her voice again, soft and distant, floating on the wind. "They always come back." Then we saw it, just a few feet offshore, our boat drifting in the mist. We waded through the shallow water, clambering aboard and setting sail without looking back. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the island, and there she was, standing on the shore, a sad, knowing smile on her face. In the growing light, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Behind her, scattered along the beach, were statues, more travelers, all of them in the same terrified poses, frozen forever in stone. We never spoke about what happened, and we never went back. To this day, I still hear her voice, that haunting lullaby that almost lured us to stay, and I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't escaped? Thank you for joining us on Nightfall Terrors. If this story has sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, some places are meant to remain untouched. Jess and I had been together for years, sharing a love for adventure and the outdoors. This time, we were looking for a secluded spot deep within the national forest, far from the usual campsites. We wanted complete solitude, a quiet escape from our busy lives. After hours of driving on bumpy trails, we parked the car at the edge of an old path and set off on foot, hiking for miles until we found the perfect clearing surrounded by towering pines. There was an eerie beauty to it. The trees formed a nearly perfect circle, and the air was so silent that even our whispers seemed to hang in the air. As the sun set, the quiet started to feel heavier, and a strange sensation crept over me, like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the isolation. We settled by the campfire, telling stories and laughing, until Jess went silent, staring past me. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her face pale. I turned, squinting into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the dense forest, unmoving and silent. "What did you see?" I asked. I don't know. Just a shape, tall, right at the edge of the trees, she murmured, still staring. We laughed it off eventually, but the tension lingered. Something about the woods felt wrong. And then, we heard it, a low hum, like wind whipping through hollow trees, except there was no breeze, not even a hint of movement among the branches. The humming grew louder, surrounding us. Jess grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold. "Let's go inside the tent," she said, her voice trembling. We crawled into the tent, zipping it up and turning off our flashlights, hoping the darkness would keep us hidden. But the humming continued, punctuated by soft, rhythmic taps, almost like footsteps, circling our campsite. "Maybe it's an animal," I whispered, more to reassure myself than her. Jess shook her head. "No animal sounds like that." The tapping grew closer, moving around us in slow, deliberate circles, until it stopped, right outside our tent. We held our breath, too terrified to move. Then, a faint scratching started, like nails dragging down the fabric, pausing every few inches. Jess squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. The scratching moved around us, stopping at the tent flap. And then, silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. We sat there, barely daring to breathe. But just as we started to relax, there was a rustle, and the zipper on our tent began to slide open. My heart was pounding as I reached for the small hunting knife in my bag. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, slashing through the air, but there was nothing there, only an empty darkness outside the tent. That's when we heard it. A voice, low and barely a whisper, echoing from somewhere in the trees. "Why are you here?" I froze, scanning the forest, but there was no one. Only the dark shapes of trees and shadows shifting in the moonlight. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice barely steady. No answer. Just silence and that relentless, growing sense that we were being watched. Jess grabbed my hand, and we bolted out of the tent, running through the forest with no idea where we were going. The hum returned, louder this time, following us, pressing in from all sides. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, surrounding us in a nightmarish symphony. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin in the middle of the forest. Too terrified to think straight, we rushed inside, slamming the door behind us. The cabin was dark and smelled of mold and damp wood. Dust coated every surface, and the only furniture was a single wooden chair in the center of the room. The hum outside grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the windows. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her face pale with fear. "We wait," I said, though I had no idea what we were waiting for, or if waiting was even safe. Hours passed, and the hum slowly faded. Just as dawn was breaking, I glanced out the cabin window and saw them. Figures, dozens of them, tall and shadowy, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching us. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking. "Look," I whispered to Jess, who joined me at the window. Her face turned white. They stood there, unmoving, until the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest. Then, one by one, they disappeared, melting into the shadows as if they had never been there. We didn't waste a second. We grabbed our gear, bolted out of the cabin, and sprinted back to where we'd left the car, never daring to look back. To this day, Jess and I don't talk about what happened in that forest. I don't know who or what was watching us, but I know one thing for sure: we weren't alone out there. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, keep an eye on the trees. Jess and I were craving a break, a chance to leave behind our city lives and just disappear into nature. We wanted to find a spot so remote that no one else would think to go there. After combing through maps and wilderness guides, we found a place deep in the national forest. No roads nearby, no people, just trees for miles. It took us nearly half a day of driving, then a few more miles hiking along a rough, barely there trail to reach our campsite. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting a golden glow through the dense pines. The silence was profound, almost sacred. It felt like we were stepping back in time. We set up camp near a narrow stream and built a small fire. For a while, everything was perfect. We sat by the fire, talking about life and stargazing as the sky darkened, feeling like we were the only two people in the world. That first night was blissful. We fell asleep to the quiet rustle of leaves and the trickling of the stream. The next day, we decided to explore the area, following the stream as it wound deeper into the woods. After a while, we came across something strange, remnants of an old campsite. There was a tent, half collapsed and draped in moss, along with some scattered belongings, a rusty canteen, a torn jacket, and a battered flashlight lying in the dirt. It looked like no one had been there in years. Jess and I exchanged a look. This was supposed to be an isolated spot. We hadn't expected to find any sign of people, let alone a campsite this far out. Maybe it's just from a long time ago, Jess suggested, poking the tent with a stick. But as we inspected the site, we noticed footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the campsite and into the dense trees. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's go back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We made our way back to our campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. That night, as we sat by the fire, the silence felt heavier. The forest around us seemed different, as if the trees themselves were closing in. Then, just as Jess was about to speak, we heard it, a faint rustling sound in the underbrush, just beyond the circle of our campfire's light. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the darkness, but there was nothing, only shadows cast by the flickering fire. We tried to shake off the tension and go to bed, but neither of us could sleep. I lay there, listening to every little noise outside the tent. I could feel my heart pounding. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft rustling, a thud against the barn. I went to the window and saw them again. 3 shadows, this time moving slowly around the barn, never getting closer to the house, just circling. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't have a phone. I was trying to live off the grid, but what could I do? I stayed in the shadows, watching them from my window, paralyzed with fear. The next morning, I went out to the barn. The tracks were fresh in the dirt, leading around it, but nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed. It was like they just wanted me to know they were there, to remind me that I wasn't alone. From that point on, I kept my uncle's old shotgun by the door. I wasn't going to be chased off without a fight, but the whole situation made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I saw smoke rising from the edge of my property. I grabbed the shotgun and headed out, thinking maybe it was a controlled burn. But when I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just fire. It was a patch of grass burning, and the same men were standing around it, watching it burn. I shouted at them, demanding they leave my property. But the tallest one, the one who always spoke, just looked at me with cold eyes and said, "This isn't your land. You need to leave." I told him it was my land, that I inherited it legally. But he only repeated, "This isn't your land. You need to leave." The calmness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I felt powerless, trapped. They didn't move, didn't say anything else, just stood there as the fire burned out. That night, I stayed inside, keeping the lights off and the blinds closed. I thought about what I had to do. Maybe I should leave. Maybe I should sell the place and never look back. But I didn't want to be chased off. The thought of them just standing there, staring at me, made me angry, but it also terrified me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing soft tapping noises on the windows, like someone was knocking. But when I looked, there was no one there. The next morning, I found something on my porch. A small pile of bones, animal bones, arranged in a perfect circle. I knew it was them. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it was a message. I threw the bones into the woods, shouting into the trees that I wasn't going anywhere. But as I worked on fixing the fence that afternoon, I saw something I wasn't ready for. Fresh footprints, leading from the woods, right up to the back of the barn. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anyone. But I knew they were there. And that was enough. I decided to leave. I packed up a few things, grabbed the shotgun, and started to drive into town, figuring I'd come back with someone else. But as I drove away, I saw them again, standing at the edge of the field. This time, there were more of them. 5, maybe 6. All just standing there, watching. I shouted at them, calling them trespassers, threatening to call the cops. But the tall one stepped forward and said again, "This isn't your land. Leave now, and you'll be safe." There was something different in his voice this time, something final. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. I didn't look back as I drove to the sheriff's office. I told him everything, the men, the bones, the fire. But the sheriff just listened, nodding, telling me he'd send someone to check it out. I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. I stayed in town for a few days, trying to gather my thoughts. When I finally went back to the farm, I took a friend with me. We arrived to find everything quiet. No sign of the men. No footprints. Nothing disturbed. But I knew they had been there. I felt it. And when my friend shrugged it off, telling me I was imagining things, I didn't argue. I knew what I had seen, and I knew what they wanted. Last summer, I embarked on a solo kayaking trip down a remote river in the heart of the forest. It was a route I'd planned for months, a 3-day escape from the noise of life. Just me, nature, and miles of unspoiled wilderness. I've done trips like this before, and the idea of solitude on the river always brought me peace. I knew what to expect: quiet waters, dense trees lining both banks, and, hopefully, no sign of human life for days. The first day went smoothly. The river was calm, the weather perfect, and the sounds of the forest were all I needed to clear my mind. I paddled for hours, soaking in the isolation. By late afternoon, I found a small sandy bank by the river, a good place to set up camp. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the night under a sky full of stars. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke early, eager to get back on the water. I packed up my camp and set off, determined to cover a lot of ground. The river narrowed in some areas, and in others, the currents picked up, but nothing too treacherous. Around midday, I stopped to rest, pulling my kayak up onto the bank. That's when I noticed him, another kayaker, gliding toward me from behind. I hadn't heard him approach, which was strange because the river was usually so quiet. He waved, and I returned the gesture. He paddled up beside me and introduced himself as Dan, also out for a solo trip. His easy smile and friendly demeanor put me at ease, but something felt off. The conversation quickly veered into strange territory. He asked where I was from, if I was alone, if I had a phone with me. I gave short answers, not wanting to be rude, but something about the way he asked those questions didn't sit right with me. As we paddled along, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying me, watching me more than was normal. I decided to paddle faster, hoping he'd take the hint, but no matter how hard I pushed, he stayed just behind me, mirroring my pace. I tried taking a different route, veering off down a side channel, but he followed, as if he knew exactly what I was doing. By the time the sun began to set, I found a small clearing along the riverbank to camp for the night. My hope was that he would keep going, but he pulled up right behind me. "This looks like a good spot to stop," he said casually, setting up his own camp right next to mine. I did my best to stay calm, setting up my tent further away from his, keeping my kayak close in case I needed to leave quickly. The night dragged on in uneasy silence. I could hear him moving around outside, his fire crackling. My thoughts raced. He had asked if I was alone, if I had a phone, if I had called for help. I realized he had been trying to figure out if anyone knew where I was, if anyone would come looking for me. I must have dozed off at some point, but I was awakened by soft footsteps outside my tent. My heart pounded. I gripped my paddle, the only weapon I had, and lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped after a while, moving away from my tent. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there, listening to the night, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of him. As dawn broke, I packed up quickly. I wanted to be back on the river, away from him. When I crawled out of my tent, I saw him watching me from his camp. His expression was unreadable, but I could feel the tension in the air. Without a word, I got back in my kayak, paddling hard, praying I could get away from him. But he was there. Always just behind me. At midday, the river narrowed and the current picked up. I knew the rapids were ahead, but I had no choice. I pushed forward into the rough water, paddling as fast as I could, praying I could lose him in the chaos. The rapids tossed my kayak, but I managed to stay on course. When I finally emerged from the rapids, I looked back. He was gone. I didn't feel safe, though. I didn't stop. I just kept paddling. Hours passed, and I reached a small stretch of river where I decided to camp for the night. This time, I didn't set up my tent. I hid in the trees, keeping my kayak nearby, watching the water. I didn't sleep. I just waited. The next morning, the relief I felt when I finally saw the old bridge marking the end of my journey was indescribable. I paddled faster, desperate to reach it. When I finally pulled my kayak onto the bank and ran to my car, I looked back. The river was calm, and there was no sign of Dan. I didn't wait around to see if he was out there. I jumped in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the nearest town. At the police station, I told them everything. They listened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They promised to check the river, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. There was no trace of him, no evidence that he had ever been there at all. I've never been back to that river, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I think about him. About Dan. And I wonder, what did he want from me? Was he just another lost soul on the river, or something far darker? I don't know, and maybe I never will. But I'm sure of one thing, I was lucky to get away.